Howdy, birders. My name is Scaly Cottontop, and I'm here to go over the results of this year's Ramsey Canyon Christmas bird count. I'm going to take a few minutes to walk you through some of the basics around this year's count, and then I'll talk about some of the trends the Christmas bird count is showing about us birds in the count circle. Well, let's go over to the results board and take a look. First of all, it sounds like you had another great count, and as always, your hard work is greatly appreciated. Let's take a look at how many of you were actually out there counting. The chart on the left shows the trend of participation over the last 47 years of bird counts. The solid blue line shows the number of counters on each count, while the solid orange line shows the number of party hours, which is how the CBC participation is formally tracked. The two dotted lines show the linear trends in corresponding colors to the two data sets. When you look at the 20-year trend, you can see the number of counters is trending up, which is great, while the number of party hours is trending down. Why are they different? Well, two explanations come to mind. First is that there are just more counters per party, which makes it more fun, so that's great. The second is that the parties are spending less time in the field on count day. We all know you're busy, so that's okay, but something to consider when you make your plans for next year's count. One important point about participation is that we have an important group of counters doing feeder watching at their homes. About 23% of all counters on count day are feeder watchers, and they see a lot of birds too. About 18% of all birds seen on the count, to be specific, and for some species, feeder watchers actually make up the majority of birds seen on the count. You all know that us scaled quail love feeders, so it shouldn't be too shocking that 75% of all scalies seen in this year's count were seen by feeder watchers. Okay, so with all these counters out looking for birds on count day, what was it like out there? Well, it was pretty nice, with cool mornings in the 30s and warm afternoons in the 70s. In this graph, you'll see that the trend line for both the low and the high temperatures are on the rise over the last 47 years. So, if you felt cold out there on count day morning, just imagine how cold the counters were in 1979. How much ground did you all cover? Well, most of you know that our circle is centered between Ramsey and Hereford roads, about halfway between the Huachuca Mountains and the San Pedro River. All CBC circles are the same size, with a diameter of 15 miles. If you do the math, that's about 175 square miles. This covers the southern portion of Sierra Vista and the San Pedro River from San Pedro House all the way to just above the Palominas, just about all of Hereford down to just north of the Mexico border, and most of the southern portion of the Huachuca Mountains. But it's not just about the square miles, as one of the factors that makes this region such good birding is the variety of habitats as you change in elevation. Thanks to the ambition and fitness of one of the visiting birders, who summited Miller Peak, we covered the full elevation of the territory for the first time in quite a while. This extends about 5,490 feet from the San Pedro River up to Miller Peak. One interesting point about these two extremely diverse habitats is that rock wrens were found at both. Throw some in across the grasslands and foothills along with one in Sierra Vista, and you get a sense as to how adaptable these little birds are. Of course, the numbers that everybody is waiting for is how many species did y'all end up with on the count? Well, keep in mind that all results are subject to further levels of review, so these results are still tentative, but you managed to find 159 species on count day. So where does that rate against past counts? You can see from the chart that you weren't far from the highest count ever, which is 164 back in 1988. You can also see that the trend over the last 47 years is going up. However, if you look at this chart for the last 20 years, the trend is going down. So maybe something to keep an eye on as you move forward. But regardless, 2024 was a great count with great results. So, what were the best birds found on the count this year? Well, you found two new birds for count: the black-crowned night heron and the white-faced ibis. You also found several other birds seen on less than 10% of counts. You can see them listed here. You missed some too. Here are the birds we missed with the highest historical percentage of counts they had been seen on. Some of these, like the prairie falcon, canvasback, and ferruginous hawk, have become much rarer recently, as the habitat makeup of the valley has changed. Barn owls are certainly out there, but are hard to find, while cedar waxwings are out there, but you just didn't find them on count day. They were seen the day before the count, however. Golden eagles seem to be mostly on the edge of the circle, and you just have to get a bit lucky. Cassin's finches are truly an eruptive species in this area, and this doesn't seem to be a good year. Lesser scaup, on the other hand, are pretty consistent, but this seems to be a bad season for them so far. Oh yeah, there were a few birds missed on the count that we did manage to find during count week. Too bad we missed those close calls. Okay, with the basics covered, I'm going to go through specific trends of what was seen on the count. One thing to consider when looking at this analysis is that it should be considered mostly anecdotal and not a statistically valid science level review. After all, I'm just a quail, but it's still fun to look at, and I'm sure you can come up with some of your own theories to explain what's happening. Let's start with the total birds seen during the count. On this chart, like all these trend charts I'll show you, you'll see two solid lines. One of the lines shows the actual count, while the other shows an adjusted count. As we see in previous charts, the number of party hours varies greatly from year to year, and so what the adjusted count number does is a basic adjustment to account for the number of counting parties in the field that year. This isn't perfect, but it helps even out some of those years when the counters were unusually low or high. To help show the trends, both the actual and adjusted count, a linear trend line is shown as a dotted line. So, looking at the total bird counts, you can see that the 47-year trend is downward, with the adjusted declining a bit more steeply than the actual count. This, of course, is alarming and probably not a surprise to those who've been birding in this area for a long time. A little more encouraging view is had when you look at the 20-year trend. While the actual count trend line is still declining, the adjusted count looks to have stabilized to a nearly level trend. Maybe this is an indicator of populations plateauing. You'll just have to keep counting to see where this goes. A simple grouping of all the species ever seen on the count shows that the vast majority are in a pretty steady state. This, however, is a bit deceiving. A large portion of these species in the steady category are actually species seen so infrequently on counts that there really is no chance to create a rising or falling trend. Perhaps, then, this chart is a better way to look at the breakdown. It shows the same categories, but only for species that have been found on over half of the last 47 years of counts. There are still a lot of species in the steady category, but you can see how proportionally the increasing and decreasing trends would be more impactful to the overall numbers. You might be asking, what are the species that are increasing and decreasing the most, and why are they? Well, let's dig in a bit further. Let's start with the bird with the biggest increasing trend over the last 47 years. It's the rock pigeon. If I was going to speculate as to why, well, we all know how these pigeons love to hang around you people. Perhaps the urbanization of the region has something to do with this increase. If you look at this map, you'll see that the rock pigeons were seen in this year's count primarily in the most urbanized areas of the count. Interestingly, this next graph shows the trend over the last 20 years being nearly flat or even decreasing. Maybe the pigeons have reached a maximum population supportable in town. The next bird on the increasing list is the lesser goldfinch. This one's a bit harder to speculate a good reason for. Maybe it also is a function of more houses, and thus more feeders. Lesser goldfinches certainly lack feeders. Or maybe it's just general population growth in an increasingly more successful species. One thing is for sure, they were just about everywhere in the count circle this year. Maybe this hints at a very adaptable species. Just like the rock pigeon, you can see the increasing trend does not translate into a more recent 20-year trend. Here is the white-winged dove 47-year data. This looks like a range expansion story, if perhaps just seasonally. And while increased urbanization and more feeders might be a factor as well, the results from this year's count show a pretty varied range of habitat for these doves, suggesting broader factors at play. And look at the 20-year trend. It is still showing increases. It will be interesting to see if this trend continues. Our next increasing bird is American widgeon. Both the 47-year and 20-year trends are increasing, albeit a bit slower in the 20-year data. So, what's going on here? Let's take a look at where these birds occurred in this year's count. You can see two primary areas in A7 and A8, with a view along the river in A13. Well, what's going on in A7 and A8? Area 7 has the golf course and the associated ponds, and Area 8 has the EOP. It seems reasonable to think that development, growth, and management practices at these two facilities has been more and more favorable to these ducks over the years. Up next is a classic invasion story. Eurasian collared doves showed up in the eastern U.S. many years ago and began spreading west, apparently reaching the Ramsey Canyon Circle in 2005. After the initial push, the 20-year trend graph shows only a slight increase over the past 20 years, indicating a likely stabilization in the local population. Our final success story is the Gila woodpecker. You can see that both the 47-year trend as well as the 20-year trend for these birds is on the steady increase. Why is this happening? Well, this year's count occurrence map might give us a clue. You can see this is a widespread bird in the circle, and some of the other factors I talked about previously might be at play. You can also see, though, that this bird, while widespread, is more prominent in the areas around the San Pedro River. It's possible that the conversion of this habitat from agriculture and ranching and the resulting maturation of cottonwoods and willows along the river have greatly benefited this species. Okay, so unfortunately we have to turn our attention to the sadder stories of our population decreases. Our first story is that of the horned lark. You can see a serious drop in this graph of the horned lark over the past 47 years. Perhaps the same success story for the Gila woodpecker of the rewilding of the area around the San Pedro River has been the undoing of our horned lark population. As farming and ranching have diminished greatly in the San Pedro Valley, the horned larks have likely suffered. If you go over to the neighboring Sulphur Springs Valley, where there's still a lot of agriculture, you can find large populations. If you look at where these birds occurred in the count, you can see it was only in Area 8 in the EOP. There doesn't seem to be much other suitable habitat in the circle. If you look at the past 20 years, the trend is probably just a representation of what is happening at the EOP over that time, and it's not great either. You may have to live with the horned lark being more of a hit or miss bird for the count in the future. Next on our list is a northern shoveler. you can see a significant drop over the 47-year history of the count. Now, I'm just a quail, and we don't live long enough for me to know what was going on back in the 90s, so maybe there was some other water source that held a lot of these ducks that's gone now. If you look at where we found these birds this year, they were all at the EOP. I overheard some birders talking about how back before the settling ponds were decommissioned at the EOP, these held lots of northern shovelers. This view of the past 20 years probably supports that idea as a driver for the count decreases. The overall story of the lark bunting on this count is probably about the same as that of the horned lark. Reduction in agriculture and the resulting habitat loss creating a decreasing trend for the count. The 47-year trend graph shows this significant decline. There is a twist to this story, though. As noted by many of the local birders, this has been the best fall for the lark buntings in the San Pedro River Valley for many years. If you look at the 20-year data, you can see many years with 0 birds found in the count, and then this year's spike. This is nothing compared to quantities found in past years, but it is notable. Without the habitat like that found in the neighboring Sulphur Springs Valley, it's probably never going back to previous levels, and there might just be eruptive years when the overall population is large, or other factors are forcing more birds into this valley. You'll just have to see if they come back next year. Our next bird is a telling one. At the countdown dinner, when Steve asks if anyone saw white-crowned sparrows, he usually gets a few chuckles before just about everyone says, yes. They do seem to be just about everywhere in the count circle. In fact, it is the most numerous bird in the count, but also one of the most seriously declining birds as well. This is evident in the 47-year trend. The story here is probably one of multiple factors. Climate, drought, urbanization, and habitat loss come to mind. All the things that you birders worry about when thinking about bird populations. The last thing I wanted to show you was my graph. As you can see, we are on the decline over the past 47 years. It's not all bad news, though. You can see this year's count was the most in 15 years. Maybe next year there'll be even more of us out there. Okay, well, that's all for me. Time to go back out and look for seeds. Steve wanted me to tell you thanks again for all your hard work on count day. Hopefully you had fun. See you next year.